Good morning. Today we start applying the dim hypothesis, and we start with the field of literature, which is chapter 5 of the book, but lecture 4 of the course. Since the modern world was ushered in by the rediscovery and excited embrace of the ancients, it's hardly surprising that the first post-Renaissance approach to literature was to imitate the classics. Classicism, later called neoclassicism, dominated the theater of the Age of Reason and, in less rigid form, the literature of the Enlightenment. The modern novel had not yet been created. And the two seminal playwrights here that I want to look at are the 17th century French dramatists Corneille and Racine. Now let me interject here that I wrote this some time ago, and in thinking about it, I don't feel that I've given a representative presentation of the 17th century mind and mode of integration, and that what is missing is a different form in a different country, and the perfect example of that would be Paradise Lost of Milton. So you won't get that today, but that will be substantially longer in the book than the part that I'm giving you today. It won't change anything, but it'll give a breadth and a scope that you can say, yes, this is really the 20th century, rather than two French playwrights. Now, literature, aside from much poetry, consists in essence of events enacted by characters. The nature of any literary school, therefore, including its mode of integration, is to be found in its treatment of these two aspects, events and characters. Now, in classicist drama, there are few events for the audience to observe. As a rule, action takes place off stage, and the audience learns of it only from a character's narration. Further, in the name of good taste and serenity of outlook, which the classicists very strongly valued, many kinds of actions, however dramatic they might be, are banned. There can be no violence on stage, no fights, no crimes, not even a crowd scene is allowed. The central concern of these plays is not the characters' physical action, but rather their mental state, such as their feeling of romantic love, or rage at injustice, passion for liberty, or despair at the decree of fate. And even these feelings are not dramatized on stage. For example, there is nothing like the balcony scene in Shakespeare in which a woman is wooed and seduced before our eyes. The equivalent in classicist drama would be a man's flat, unexplained assertion that he loves her in beautiful poetry. And even these assertions, for the most part, when he says he loves her, are delivered on aesthetic principle, politely, with emotional restraint, and in decorous speeches. The speeches, by the way, are clear, logical, precisely worded, elegant, and often, in my opinion, supremely beautiful. They are the poetry of love or despair, but they are not its reality. To the extent that there are events of any kind on stage, there is very little progression among them, because according to classicist rules, the whole play must be set in a single location and must occur within a 24-hour time period. That's called the rules of the unity of place and time. We don't therefore know how or why across time the characters have reached their desires and conflict. In effect, we come in only at the climax, watching without context as the protagonist's desperate struggle is stated, elaborated, and resolved. As someone has said, we see the end of the story, but not the beginning or the middle. And I quote one commentator, "Nothing really happens. In a sense, these plays do not really tell a story at all." Now, the main character in these plays is almost always torn by a special agonizing kind of conflict. It is the conflict between his sense of honor and some crucial personal value of his, which honor, he believes, does not countenance. In other words, it's virtue versus desire, or duty versus selfishness. Now, the character is always highly moral as he understands the concept. So he usually struggles against and finally defeats the lure of self-assertion in order to embrace the rigor of overcoming his personal desire. Now, sometimes, to be accurate, I should say, the hero chooses duty over desire, but nevertheless still gains his desire. So the ending is happy. But more commonly, he is stoic in the face of tragedy. Either way, however, the hero, especially in Corneille, whom I recommend to you, just for enjoyable reading, the hero in Corneille is a hero. He is unflinchingly courageous in defending his cause. He's self-directed, self-responsible, and proud of his ability to be guided as he sees it by his rational faculty. Now, in the depiction of both events and characters, the classicists upheld as aesthetic requirements the values of simplicity and concentration. Their plays, accordingly, almost always revolve around a single issue culminating in a single decision. Subplots are banned. The characters reveal only their torture in a single situation and their strength in wrestling with it for several hours. Now, since the range of qualities of a man's character and even the detail of a unique situation cannot be concentrated in the requisite sense, this kind of range and detail cannot be portrayed in the work. The result is that both events and characters, though in part, concrete and even compelling, are also in part thin and generalized. Largely, we see the same abstract type of man facing the same abstract type of problem in plays that do not vary significantly in this regard from one another. There's no differences of the order, for example, of King Lear from Othello, of the protagonist raving helplessly through a thunderstorm as the villain fiendishly plotting a great hero's death. Now, both of those are Shakespearean tragedies, but they're radically different. There's no such radical difference among classicist dramas. I think the best way to describe it is that they have semi-generalized characterization. And it not infrequently leaves a spectator with the impression that the play is concerned with a realm of abstractions which have primacy over concretes. The general duty-desire conflict, for instance, strikes you in many cases as the real nature of the proceedings, and that the individual players and behavior pop up as concrete examples and then recede. And this kind of impression of the dominance of the abstraction over the concrete is heightened by the fact that the substance of the play is a flow of beautiful concepts, language, essentially unrelated to action. Now, classicists defend their approach to literature by reference to an explicit set of values, which define for them artistic excellence. These values, suggested to them by the surviving works of antiquity, they regarded as self-evident criteria of aesthetic merit. And as such, the validity of these standards is to be grasped not by any kind of inference, because they're self-evident, but by the standard means of rationalists, what was called intellectual intuition. And this meant self-evident axioms grasped on the purely conceptual level, not based on sensory observation. That's what intellectual intuition there is not meant as a mystical term. It means a direct grasp. Now, objectivism, of course, says that there's only self-evidency on the perceptual level. But intellectual intuition is self-evidency on the conceptual level. So it presupposes that concepts are prior in knowledge to percepts. Now, the values that were commonly intuited by the classicists include order, clarity, reason, emotional restraint, balance, symmetry, decorousness, simplicity, idealism, nobility, dignity, universality, and unity, and more that I'm leaving out. Now, I think the analogy to the prisoner in Plato's cave is apparent here. Prompted by sense data, in this case by the works of antiquity, the prisoner ascends to the forms, in this case the concepts defining aesthetic merit, where intuition and not experience reveals the truth through the medium of connecting abstractions independent of sense perception. Now, at this point, Plato proceeded upwards to the highest abstraction, but the classicists, writing in the 17th century, seek to apply their floating abstractions to concretes. In other words, to their aesthetic creations and characters in this world. The problem is that their deductive inferences in this task have a sizable element of the arbitrary, because it's very difficult, to put it mildly, to apply objectively to worldly art abstractions that were reached and validated independently of it. So here's an example of some of the classicists' deductions. From the value of unity, which they also based allegedly on the authority of Aristotle, the classicists derived the highly constricting unities of time and place. Emotional restraint as a standard led them to the deliberate avoidance even of vivid imagery. Dignity, for a last instance, entailed in their opinion an elevated style of writing which eschewed vulgar words such as knife, cow, and dog. I just might mention that the French were shocked when Othello was performed and a handkerchief was dropped. You know, a handkerchief in a play is, I don't know what it would be like today. There's no equivalent. Because you can't be shocked by anything today. So the source of proper aesthetic standards in the classicist view is not the facts of reality, but the works of the ancients, and in turn, in 17th century eyes, on their source and validator, God. So in this fashion, classicism, though its writers do not promote God in their plays, is at root, if you ask for the ultimate justification, it's the view that God is the root of values, which of course is the standard religious view. I think you can see the classicists' basic mode of integration lies in their adoption of the Platonist framework, in the elevation of concepts over percepts. And the school is generally defined by all observers as the elevation of form over matter. And that's the textbook definition of Platonism. Form in the literary context denotes what they regard as the rational, abstract, and immutable rules of drama, which to them logically precede and govern a play's matter. Matter denotes the flux of worldly events, emotions, and struggles, which are in the play, in which the broad abstractions of form give logical order to and thereby integrate. And the classicist playwright was always cautioned to follow these rules no matter what, because if he disregarded these a priori abstractions, his work was regarded as inherently non-objective, non-rational, and non-good. The classicists, however, are not pure Platonists. Writing in the new modern era, They exhibit the same philosophic approach, the same mode of integration as their much more famous contemporary, also French, Descartes. Unlike Plato, they do not dismiss concretization as trafficking in unreality. To them, the perceptual world, though a derivative of the transcendent, is still real. So concepts, in their view, must be translated on stage, for instance, the duty-desire conflict, into some kind of perceptual worldly individuals and events. Now, the fact that their Platonism subverts this event and that the characters are only semi-generalized should not obscure the equally important fact that they attempt it, and that the attempt partly, quite significantly, succeeds. So I think you can see that on the basis of Platonism, they use that to ground a worldly embrace within literature that is condemned by Plato. So these are what I call worldly supernaturalists. And you could figure that out from the fact that they are Christians who admire the pagans. So the secular element in their work is hardly a surprise. This literature is clearly M1. The one, the play's unity of form, the abstraction unites the many because it precedes and transcends the many. All right, let's go to the second school. The most famous school which rebelled against classicism was Romanticism. That was the next to dominate the West. Although there are many Romanticist plays, at this point the novel was thoroughly understood and became the leading form of literature. Now I'm taking for granted here that you know all about the philosophy of Romanticism from the Romantic Manifesto. Man has free will, is the base, therefore he has the capacity to choose and pursue values. And you see a contrast here, whereas the classicist fights to defeat his desires, in other words, his values. The Romanticist hero is intoxicated by his own goals. He is defined by his wholehearted use of his will to gain and keep that which he is after. Now, some obvious contrast with the classicist. Romanticist characters, though highly articulate, express their values primarily by what they do. The speeches they make are not poetry to be savored as an end in itself, but statements that lead to or flow from action, whether on stage or between the covers of a novel. And action here involves primarily struggle, not over introspective conflicts, I want versus I should, but over existential conflicts fought out against real opponents in the physical world. And that leads to Ayn Rand's definition of plot, top essential of Romanticism, from which I'm just going to read a few words for my purposes. A plot is a progression of logically connected events. Logically connected events. A sequence in which nothing is irrelevant, arbitrary, or accidental. We'll get back to that. Now, as an intense valuer, the Romanticist protagonist is necessarily a hero, an individual with a stature that is larger than life. And you know, of course, Aristotle and Ayn Rand put it in the famous formula, he represents things as they might be and ought to be. Now, I have to add that heroes are not unique to Romanticism, but what is unique, or almost unique, is the view that they are self-created, that they're heroes by the exercise of their own will. And now you could ask, how can a writer create heroes who are larger, better than life, while knowing from observation only men as they are? And the answer, which was given long ago by Aristotle, is by abstraction from sense experience. The Romanticist writer stylizes his characters. He strips away non-essentials, and so he is free to embody in his characters the attributes, whether good or evil, that he observes in people, but embody them in purer, more consistent terms than you can find in life. In essence, he creates a hero by observing non-heroes and then distinguishing their qualities conceptually. Now, because of their commitment to perceptual observation and individualist, will-driven heroes, the characters of the leading Romanticists, though created conceptually, are nevertheless unique concretes, not interchangeable giants. And for example, here are three Romanticist heroes. In contrast, Francisco d'Ancona to Jean Valjean, and both to Cyrano. There are three absolutely different and unique people, but then take three equivalents from classicist literature, if you know it, Cinna or Phaedra or even Lucide. They merge into one another much more than they stand out as unique individuals. Now, in both respects, events and characters, the Romanticist work is a unity. First of all, the unity of events and of characters each entails the other in a Romanticist work. Not only because actions entail actors and vice versa, but more basically, unity because both are entailed by the Romanticist work's fundamental integrator, its theme. In essence, the characters and events are the work's concretes, while the theme is the concept that unites them into an entity or whole, if you remember how we defined whole. Now, classicist plays do have themes, but for them, the theme is not regarded as the integrator of the play. The play's adherence to the rules of the classicist canon are the integrator, and the theme may be very important, but it belongs to the play's matter for classicism. It's not what makes it a unity. Now here you see the reversal again of Romanticism and Classicism. If the free choice of values is the root and ultimate shaper of a play or a novel, then clearly its matter, what it's about, what the characters do, what it means, that has primacy over its form. In other words, how or in accordance with what rules it says these things. So for the Romantics of the 19th century, you could say there's a parallel, although they didn't use the words, to modern architects of the 20th. Form follows function, not form as the judge. Now here you see, I think, a purely Aristotelian approach to the relationship of the one and the many. The whole movement is ruled throughout by the deliberate integration of percepts and concepts. The concepts involved do not float. They're always derived from perception and then concretized and stylized by the artist's mind. Just as the perceived events that you read about do not merely coexist, but are necessarily connected to a deliberate conceptual meaning. The work, therefore, is of many characters, many events, but so connected by the author as to be a one in the many. And of course, a purely secular one, even if the theme is religious, because it has no transcendent connotations as a unified, integrated work. It's the creation of the unaided human conceptual faculty, and the one has no reality apart from man's integrating power. So, in dim terms, you have to classify Romanticism as an I movement. Now, let me restate this for clarity. The themes of a Romanticist may be thoroughly supernaturalist. The arch example here is Dostoevsky. Nevertheless, as a Romanticist, his mode of integration is completely I. Logical plot, stylized, integrated, profoundly analyzed characters, all embracing theme, worldly content, and what happens as the substance and the importance. All of that is the rational, valid integration, and that is therefore definitely I. So you have to distinguish what makes the work of art and what message is the. If he has a message, that already puts him in a certain view of integration as against the people who have no message. And the content of the message is not important. The question is, does the message integrate the events and the characters? Now, a quick aside here. Lecture, an earlier lecture, I said that consistency in your mode of integration demands a conscious knowledge of the issues involved. Remember I said I was going to make an exception? Well, this is where I would make it, but I haven't got the time. So if you want to hear what it is, ask in the question period. All right, now let's hasten on to the next movement to dominate the literary world, and that, of course, was naturalism, which held sway from the later part of the 19th century well into the 20th. Just as Romanticism rebelled against Classicism, so naturalism rebels against Romanticism. And following the consensus of the time, they regarded Romanticism as merely a form of emotionalism. That's how they identified the stress on values. By contrast, they held their writers are the champions of reason. Not, of course, in the classicist sense of serene decorum, which is not exactly how you describe a naturalist novel, but in their own sense. The naturalist author is required to regard himself in the common metaphors as a recorder, a camera, a reporter. And here is Stendhal as early as 1830 saying, quote, "A novel is a mirror walking along a road," unquote. So that you're supposed to present your subjects without preconceptions, selectivity, or moralizing. You're supposed to emulate the scientist. You want an unbiased, value-free objectivity. You have no interest in uplifting or having any other type of effect on the audience, leaving aside socially crusading naturalists who are not really consistent with the school. On the contrary, so far from uplifting the audience, the novelist is supposed to tell it like it is, even if it is sordid, and it is a good part of the time. Here's Chekhov, quote, "To a chemist," he's the chemist of literature, "to a chemist nothing on earth is unclean. He must know that dung heaps play a very respectable part in a landscape." So what is their idea of the Romanticist view of beauty and of heroes and of free will? The whole thing is a myth. It's an escape from the reality of man's helplessness, man being totally determined. So to a naturalist, characterization is the essential task of literature. In the early years, writers such as Tolstoy and Balzac reproduced characters who were given broad abstract meaning. And such works did carry universal and timeless themes. In the course of the development of the movement, however, the universal characterizations, such as the adulterous wife, gave way instead to a detailed description of a typical small-town businesswoman living in the American Midwest in the 1920s, the Sinclair Lewis type. And on principle, the purpose was specifically to capture the concrete subject. To that end, naturalist description is highly detailed. The school on principle will not distinguish the essence of a character from his accidental or irrelevant features. And guess what they call the concept of essence as applied to characterization? It is a piece of metaphysics. A man is simply everything we see him do, feel, and say. All of these are equally real. All of these are equally observable. So all deserve the same descriptive attention from the artist. Now, does that make you think of anybody from lecture 2? Well, maybe this next one will. If you ask the naturalist to explain what he presents, explain the people, explain the actions, they reject the idea. They say, we offer what happens. We're not concerned with why. If you want some kind of unifying explanation lurking behind the observed data, that's metaphysics again. A photograph doesn't explain its subject. It merely records its surface. Well, what then, is there then any necessary connections? Well, some, but not between all of them. There's no necessary connection between a character's various ideas, traits, and actions. The main reason why we present him is because that's the way these people are. That's what they do. Now, since most men that you observe, in fact, have some underlying logic and motives binding their behavior to some extent, naturalists generally do present or imply some logical connections between their characters, traits, and actions. But they present connections only in chunks within a framework of disconnected and irrelevant data. But there's enough chunks so the characters are recognizable and not just collections of surface detail. Now, in regard to story, most naturalists, not all, think it of some importance and do offer a progression of events, sometimes very interesting, but primarily as the peg on which to hang their characterizations. And the stories, of course, they stress, don't give you these romanticist fantasies. They give you life as it is. And just as there is no essence of a character, so there is no essence of the events that occur in life as it is. In real life, they say, what we actually perceive are merely events that follow one another. Juxtaposition, but not logical connection. So what do they think of the idea of the plots of the Romanticists where each event is logically connected in an inexorable progression? Artificial, contrived, unreal. That's not the way life is. Life, as they commonly say, is not logical, but messy. And we just present, one line of the mess. Life is not, reach some climax. It happens and it can be smashed by who knows what. Now, I think the best example I've ever read of this, because it's so brief, is Turgenev's novel On the Eve, is the title. And this is the entire story. A young fighter, this is a novel, a young fighter for freedom prepares to do battle, falls in love, is caught by bad luck in the rain, and before he can set out for the war, dies of pneumonia. The end. And if you asked him, well, how do you justify a novel like that? He'd say these things happen. And as a matter of fact, I think it did happen. And so he just, fictionalized. And since the guy died, the story came to an end. Now, what is the naturalist view of theme? Well, in theory, naturalists are against the idea of theme. You are not supposed to bring an interpretive or evaluative framework to the work. Your task, like that of the chemist, does not include sending didactic messages. In fact, however, most naturalists do offer some kind of theme, and as I've indicated, sometimes the themes were comparatively broad, as in Tolstoy. Gradually, however, the themes narrowed right in accordance with the 19th century's conceptual shrinkage, which we have talked about. And by the time you got, late in the naturalist movement, you had a theme like Upton Sinclair, the evil of greed in the meatpacking business in the U.S. at the turn of the 20th century. That is a real, let's say, concrete theme. Nevertheless, these themes usually did not provide enough of a framework to integrate the whole work, but very often certain subsets of elements within the work. And the older the writer, the more his integrative power. The closer to the 20th century, the more his scope shrunk. So again, we don't see complete integration even in regard to theme, but integration in chunks. Now, what category does this obviously fall into? This is positivist literature. Its mode of integration is obviously in the D category. It illustrates the increasing rejection of integration as an undesirable or impossible goal. But it still offers some integration, even if only partially, in chunks. It still offers some significant conceptual connections among the data, just as Comte had authorized generalizations, but of a lower level kind. So to this extent, naturalism is an old-fashioned movement. Its exponents, though of course they are skeptics, there's no objective values, there's no free will, there's no explanations, logic doesn't apply to life. They are what I call knowing skeptics, who avow their allegiance to the many and to its knowability, but without a complete rejection of a one. Their product, their novels, looked at now in literary terms, are a many bundles of events, many bundles of character traits, but a many of unrelated ones. Not the integration of Romanticism, but not total shattering either. And that is the D1 formula of integration. Now I think you see, I hope you see, that I am not forcing my categories on these movements. The things that we discuss are blatantly there. And the only one that I said didn't give you a fair presentation of is I'd have to throw in Paradise Lost. But first of all, I have to write it. All right, now let's go to modernism. The next literary rebellion, which has dominated Western culturati, but not the Western public, of course, for over a century now. And I regard all this postmodernism and so on as just another name for the same thing. And so I regard we're still in the modernist era. Now, modernists rebel against all previous approaches to art. The previous literature with its aesthetic requirements, says Barth, is, quote, naive pretension of bourgeois rationality, unquote. Now, the essence of previous literature had been in some form the telling of a story. In other words, characters enacting events. And each of these characters, events, and their relation were forms of integration. And often it had a thematic meaning. But if we're going to reject these bourgeois pretensions, what does that mean? Well, one commentator says, what modernism really is in literature, quote, the rejection of plot and character as meaningful artistic conventions, and the rejection of meaning itself as delusory, unquote. So that's where we start. So let's look at story. Well, of course, it's devoid of story. One professor at NYU gave his students a definition of plot as, quote, contrived editorial intervention on the part of the author, unquote. So instead of story, these writers characteristically turn inwards to offer unstructured, introspective collages, such as stream of consciousness novels, replete with a flow of moods, memories, dreams, images, and contempt for works, whether romanticist or naturalist, that present man in action in the world. Now, to the extent that their books do include events, these are devoid of connection and even of intelligible progression. If you even talk about those things, they will denounce you as having a linear mind. And instead, they have random, non-logical, unintelligible juxtapositions. A well-known example is Kafka's protagonist turning into a cockroach. Actually, not merely a symbolism, and then it goes on. Now, of course, modernists reject the idea of a work having a beginning, middle, and end. And, you know, it's just shocking how explicit they are. But here's Gertrude Stein. She says, if a work had a beginning, middle, and end, then, quote, it would be of necessity and in relation, and that is just what a masterpiece is not, unquote. In other words, the elements of such a work have the disqualifying flaw of being necessarily related to one another, and that is what makes them not a masterpiece. Now, is that just conceptual shrinkage? I think it's a little more than that. Well, what does the modernist movement stand for positively? I'll give you a fortune cookie statement from a commentator on absurdist drama. The theatrical principles of absurdist drama are primarily anti-play. Now, they have worked out, these people, all kinds of techniques to eliminate story over and above, you know, unintelligibility and so on. Multiple perspectives at the same time. Chronological progression is out, so you don't know when anything is happening. The blurring of dream and reality, etc. Now, no conceptual mind or method can penetrate such works. So if you respond to them, if anybody could, it's only because they evoke in you a flow of uninterpreted sensations which somehow you find congenial. Now, the same modernist techniques work in regard to characterization. As that play guide puts it, quote, characters are reduced almost to non-entities, unquote. This takes many forms, including characters with no attributes, and characters whose behavior is unreal because it is so bizarre. As in, for instance, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, where the hero, take that back, the main creep, Hans Castorp, feverishly adores the X-ray of the tubercular lungs of the woman who spurns his love. And that's not what you would call characterization. Now, for naturalism, the unanswered question is, why does a superficially plausible character really act as he does? But for modernism is a different question. Who is acting? What is he doing? Is he really a 35-year-old man? Or a hippie on crack? Or are both really nothing but a figment of the imagination of a pregnant great-grandmother? Who knows? Obviously, none of this is approachable in conceptual terms. If anything emerges, it's only random sensory details. Now, the corollary of this campaign, the modernist campaign, against every form of logical connection in art, is their campaign against man and values. More specifically, against the depiction in art of man, now whether heroic or average, as a being who pursues values. The subject of art is not achievement, they say, but the barren. Not confidence, but the disoriented. Not beauty, but the repulsive. Now you may think, well, then they have a theme. That's the philosophic implications of their approach, which it certainly is. But nevertheless, most modernists reject the idea that a literary work should convey a meaning, a message, as they disparagingly call it, an integrating theme. Sometimes, however, they do allow a sort of theme in the form of non-objective symbols dispersed at random throughout the book. The fact that their symbolism is unclear is not, to these writers, a problem. On the contrary, it is a virtue of which they boast, because it is Philistinism to ask what a book is about. To be high art, they hold, a work must be, these are the words used by critics if you ever read them, must be ambiguous, elusive, enigmatic, indeterminate, and opaque. Those are the 5 highest compliments you can get in the New York Review of Books. Now, these very qualities are most eloquently achieved by the modernists in their distinctive use of language. Alone in the history of literature, anywhere in the world, they reject every rule of using language rationally. In many cases, they reject the need, like Gertrude Stein, of capitalization and punctuation. Instead of defined words, they like to insert neologisms. Instead of linguistic continuity, non sequiturs. Instead of grammar or syntax, word salads. A much admired example of these techniques is the soliloquy of Molly Bloom, a previously silent character at the end of James Joyce's Ulysses. Suddenly, having never spoken, she utters a single sentence without punctuation. It runs to about 2,500 words. That is considered the highest feat of the greatest artist in the 20th century. The modernists dispense with story and the rest because they say, and here they sound a bit at times like classicists, style or form is what counts in art, not content or subject matter. For the classicists, however, form has primacy because it is what determines the proper presentation of content. For the modernists, by contrast, the supremacy of form means the elimination of content. Further, the classicists regarded form as objective and rational, whereas for the modernists, form is the exact opposite. It is whatever any subjective whim dictates. In every literary issue, it is clear, rejection is the essence of the modernist credo. The qualities these writers uphold are always negatives, always blasting forms of integration created and achieved by previous artists. They are non-story, non-hero, this is what they uphold, non-character, non-meaning, non-grammar, non-language, non-objective, non-representational, non-intelligible, non-rational. Now, I think it's clear that this is no less than a declaration of war against the conceptual faculty and even against the perceptual faculty. It is obvious nihilism in literature, the quest to destroy every essential attribute that makes any work of literature in any form possible. Nihilism in any field, of course, is the advocacy of total disintegration. And in the modernist work, that is upheld. There is not even disconnected chunks of integration. There is no one any longer, not in any form, not transcendent and not partial like D1. There's only a many of shattered, unintelligibly juxtaposed bits. And again, they are proud of this. Modernism, as Barth observes, represents the, quote, frustration of expectations of unity, unquote. Its exponents, he says, prefer, quote, the disjointed to the unified, unquote. I mean, if that isn't D2, there never was D2. All right, let us go on to one last literary school. The literary schools discussed so far developed in the freer centuries of the modern West. But there have also been 20th century schools that arose within a totalitarian state, the most theoretically inclined of which was Soviet Russia. And that's the only one I'm going to look at. Whatever I have to say about Nazism, I've already written a book on. Plus, as it's been observed, the Nazis were much more interested in burning books than in theorizing about them. Now, the official literary school of communist Russia and of several of its satellites during its period of power was socialist realism. That was a literary school mandated by Stalin in the 1930s, and which ruled for the next 50 years. Any other form of Russian literature was officially prohibited. And it's interesting. I have to tell you that it is by no means unique to the modern world or to communism. That's where we're encountering it in part two. But there's plenty of this exact approach way before, and some of the art is great art, not the kind of stuff we're talking about here. But nevertheless, this will give you the idea of the form of integration. Socialist realism, like modernism, presents itself as a rebellion against all earlier literary movement. Its denunciations, however, are directed not against representationalism or objectivity, but against what it regarded as the root of all evil, bourgeois individualism. The Stalinists rejected Romanticism with its praise of the great man. They rejected naturalism with its neutral description of the average individual. They rejected modernism because of its subjectivism, which the communists interpreted as improper emphasis on the individual subject. In place of emphasis on the individual, writers were to focus on the group. In place of naturalist neutrality, the socialist realists were to pass value judgments in their work. And in place of subjectivism, they must be realists. We'll define that later. I think socialist is clear. Literature, in this view, is regarded as a didactic tool, the purpose of which is the dissemination of socialist propaganda, specifically to glorify the Communist Party, uplift the proletariat, and develop social consciousness in men. Writers are to become social engineers, helping the state to create in its citizens a new collectivist kind of soul. Now, the stories told in these works are regularly repeated. Often, only the names are changed. The story almost always starts with class struggle, either against world capitalists or their local remnants, saboteurs within, or during World War II against the Nazis, who were regarded as capitalists. The struggle presents the grievous exploitation of the proletariat and eventually culminates in its triumph and revenge after a heroic battle thanks to the support and guidance of the Communist Party. Now I'm going to give you a snippet of such a story taken from a New York Times report on a Chinese opera, because the text is literature, performed in Beijing a few years ago. Granny Shah was the soprano. Quote, she's singing, "The Communist Party of China is like the bright sun," sang Granny Shah, her face glowing through wrinkles of sorrow as she sang of abuse at the hands of a, quote, poisonous snake bloodsucker, unquote, landlord in pre-communist China. Her words were punctuated by a roar of applause from the audience. Quote, singing still, "Without the party, my whole family would have been wiped out long ago." Now she starts to be joined by many audience members spontaneously singing along. Next, the audience settled back to watch the crimes against her committed by vicious exploiters. Now that is a socialist realist opera. So you can just project what the novels are, where they don't have to waste time on singing. Now, how do these so-called realists combine faith in the party being omnipotent with the claim to be realists? And the answer lies now in their concept of realism. Remember, naturalists also regarded themselves as realists. But when they examined the empirical facts, quote, as they are, they didn't find all the phenomena that Marx found there. But when socialist realists describe facts, by contrast, empirical observation does not concern them. Reality for them is not revealed by perception, but by the higher laws of history, which often contradict perception. We'll discuss this in more detail when we get to Marx himself in Lecture 6. But here's an example of their indifference to perceptual fact. One writer in 1934, for example, quote, urged fellow authors just after the carnage in the countryside, he means here the mass murder of the peasant opponents of collectivization, urged fellow authors just after this carnage to portray the peasants' socialist joy at collectivization. That's realism. And even though it's a big lie, it's realism, because an event in the world of daily life is nothing in relation to what is really going on, namely the proletariat's movement toward inevitable victory. Is this the primacy of abstractions over percepts? You can't beat it. Now, someone is sure to say, but how could they do this since they're materialists? How can a materialist believe in a world of abstractions and turn away from the physical world? We wait for Lecture 6. All right, that was their idea of events. Turning now to their idea of characterization, its essence, as you would expect, is the exaltation of the group. The protagonist of a story must not be an individual, but a collective, and more than that, an exploited collective. Now, here's a tiny example. There's a story called Young Guard by Alexander Fadeev. One character states the point eloquently, and he's talking about one other character who has just done something heroic, to stop the exploiters. And he says, quote, "It was a bad thing to act the lone wolf. Brave and clever, but by yourself, bad." And that is the message. For the same ideological reason, when 7 flyers rescued passengers from an icebound ship in the Arctic, Pravda wrote as follows, "Is it necessary to repeat the names of the 7? For us," it went on, quote, "the main character in Soviet literature consists of people in the mass, not heroic archetypes from 19th or early 20th century literary tradition." So, now, Obviously, these writers present their characters with virtually no distinctive characteristics. They eschew traits or motives that would make an individual stand out from the mass. Indeed, the figures are typically portrayed as having no motives at all, but one single abstract concern: to witness the triumph of their political system. As a result, the characters often speak not like persons, but like government proclamations. When given a choice between the self and the social, these characters can't even understand how it could be a choice. There is no choice. They are fascinated by the industrial development of Siberia, say, but they're indifferent to anything the West would regard as personal. You understand then the crack of a non-admirer of this movement that said the essence of the school is girl meets tractor. Now, the characters of these writers have often been described as cardboard or unreal. And of course, if reality is conceived in Aristotelian terms as a realm of concrete entities, you can't criticize that. I mean, that criticism is valid. But the Aristotelian world is not the one that the characters inhabit. Being devoid of individualizing attributes, they are not concretes at all, but fragments of a collective, which is itself an abstraction, independent of concretes, and which does battle against other such abstractions. Thus, an unperceivable entity, the proletariat, that which transcends all individuals, collides with another, the bourgeoisie, and does so in order to attain another floating abstraction, the withering away of the state. Now, novels and plays such as these do not present the lives or conflicts of people, but rather a ballet of Platonic forms, a ballet succession of abstractions. The protagonists of the classicists, as we saw, are to a significant extent overgeneralized. Nevertheless, they still retain a real element of individuality, precisely because they do have personal desires and do experience personal conflicts. In metaphysical terms, they are concretes, even if subverted by rationalist abstraction. They're subverted only up to a point. In the case of socialist realism, however, floating abstraction does more than subvert. It entirely wipes out individuality. Now, by definition, all works of socialist realism have a theme, defined by their political purpose. In earlier literature, the theme is what integrated a work's content. Nor was the artist's purpose to proselytize for his ideas, but to create an artistic universe of which the theme was merely one element. In the Soviet books, by contrast, the theme does not integrate concretes, because there aren't any. Rather, it integrates abstractions into a defense of the ruling ideology. In this sense, the socialist realist book is the general statement that it makes. Or put otherwise, the theme is the work. So we have this situation. Modernism rejects the very idea of theme. Socialist realism rejects everything but theme. The modernists throw out as a distortion any conceptual integration of sense data and are left with disconnected, meaningless sensations. The socialist realists throw out as counter-revolutionary concern with sense data and are left with connected but thoroughly floating abstractions. You see the two? I assume you see. Now, since floating abstractions are independent of percepts, so must their validation be. And the defense of socialist realism does not rest on observation, but on the, quote, indubitable axioms taken from Marx and Hegel as interpreted by Stalin. Given these axioms, it's, believe it or not, pure rationalism. From those premises, Stalin deduces the purpose of art, which purpose entails a specific approach to literature, which entails a certain kind of story, character, theme, and outcome. In this manner, all the distinctive features of socialist realism presuppose the method of rationalist deduction from first principles, which are presented to the artist by the state as self-evident. Now, their mode of integration, I think, is clear. Transcendent abstractions, beyond any connection to percepts, integrated by rationalist means and presiding over an unreal and often incompatible world of particulars. That is exactly Platonism. And that is exactly the method of integration used by the Stalinists to create and unify, to integrate their artworks. So we have the complete elevation of the one over the many. We have the one without the many. And that, of course, is M2. So you see, I think, that 5 movements have dominated Western literature since the 17th century. Using my symbolism and in chronological order is M1, I, D1, D2, M2. Should I say that again? That's easy to take down, though, very brief. Now, it is not always the case that the 5 come in that order. And you'll see when we get next time to education that we have a very different order. But I think you'll see also that it is going to end up being the same 5. Well, that is my application to literature, and in just a second we'll have questions.
Okay, so I guess I'm first.
Oh my goodness, okay.
So you read a lot, I know this from experience. Has your study of this made you look at all the different types of literature that you read in a different way? Namely, I want to ask you the question, in terms of non-romantic literature, do you have a favorite genre in terms of your dim categories? Obviously, it's not D2,
of course,
right?
I wouldn't read socialist realism, and I wouldn't read modernism. So those two are the absolute worst.
Sure.
There's a lot of naturalism that I like, that I enjoy, and that I read because there's only, very little within the Romanticist movement that is, really good. And then there's an awful lot of minor, expressions of it. I read some classicism, but my understanding is that you really need to know French to really get it, that it can't be translated because it's so essentially dependent on poetry. Whereas French novels, I guess it's not as good in English, but you can really get the essence. I like I like Corneille in particular. I could identify with the hero, and you just basically pretend that it's a real conflict. What was the question?
The question was, what between classicism then versus naturalism?
Oh, I
Did you
would
say
read
you like
naturalism.
Naturalism
Because
better?
17th century, the language is also very difficult. Like, I really liked Paradise Lost when we took it in college. But because passages of it are, as anti-religious as anything you could imagine. Although, the whole thing is a defense of God. But he's the perfect M1, because the whole thing is Paradise Lost, the story of Adam's expulsion, and therefore, God is everything, and this world is nothing, and the hero, without any question, is Satan. He's the only one that's admirable and presented as admirable, and everybody always wants to know, why is Satan the hero in this deeply religious work? And that, to me, is the absolute M1. He's there, but he has to be here, and he's rebelling against, the total medievalism. I don't know, I got off the point, but okay. Oh, let me say one other thing. everybody that I discuss this with wants to know, where do you classify Shakespeare? Because I keep referring to him. Now, I could answer the easy way and say that's the Renaissance, and I'm only starting in the 17th century. But I just want to say I cannot take every writer, playwright, or novelist at random that someone throws at me and say, where do I classify him? I'd have to know, enough of his work, and I'd have to know also what kind of epistemological tradition he is writing, and what he himself says about his work, in order to be able to analyze it. I couldn't, for instance, hear a poem or read a play or whatever and say, oh, well, this one is this one is this one. That's why I confine myself to broad cultural movements, of which there are dozens, hundreds of instances, critics and authors all giving a certain line. But I do want to say something about Shakespeare, because he is such a great writer, probably the greatest of the historical writers, I think. At least certainly within playwrights. Shakespeare, in my thesis, is mixed. Remember I said there's a mixed case? There are mixed cases. If I take the three elements which I've been using to define the different categories, Shakespeare has integrated characters, and they're even large scale, who have an essence and whose actions flow from or relate to their essence. They're large scale, they're not copied from life. They're supposed, he got his original ideas from historical chronicles, but then he made the character what he wanted. He certainly has broad, universal, integrating themes. So on those two counts, I have no hesitation in putting him in the I category. But the thing that makes the huge difference is the way he treats events, the way he treats story, which is far below, in terms of integration, the other two elements. He does not crusade against plot the way the naturalists do. He would never say, I'm presenting even history as it was, because he changed the chronicles all over the place in order to get the kind of drama that he wanted. But it was obvious that to him, what counted was to create a character, create a conflict, and then resolve it. And what actually they did from step to step was of minor significance. Sometimes whole plots were resolved by a coincidence, the friar dying when he's supposed to deliver something, or somebody dropping a handkerchief. Or all he wants to do is get to the next big confrontation. His poetry, of course, is also unsurpassable. But to me, the order of events, the connection of events, as Ayn Rand said about a novel or a work of literature, there's only three essentials: plot, plot, and plot. So from my point of view, his plot is a non-feature, a non-significant feature, one that he just doesn't care about. Not that he deliberately disintegrates like the naturalist. He just takes a string of events, and then he goes to town with his poetry and his characterization. So I would classify him as mixed. In other words, he's nothing in my category in regard to events. And he is a beautiful example of integration in the others. But since events is not a minor category, I can't give him a total characterization. And therefore, I would say that, I think, is one of the reasons that Shakespeare, there's no Shakespearean era, even though he's widely adulated. First of all, I don't think people can equal what he did. But he does not bring any new mode of integration. The way all these different cultural movements that swept, the whole country, the whole continent, and the whole centuries, He doesn't bring that. He takes the best elements from Greek drama and then presents them in an amazingly more sophisticated way. But still, he doesn't introduce anything revolutionary in his mode of integration. And that's why, if he had the idea of plot that they had in the 19th century, if it were theoretically possible, then he would have introduced Romanticism. But that would have been impossible in the Renaissance, I think. Now, you didn't ask about that, did you? I'm looking right at you, but I just wanted to get that out because I'm asked that all the time. Okay, someone over here? Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned that there were earlier examples of M2 that had higher stature of art as art earlier than the Soviet realism, socialist realism. Could you comment on what they are and some examples?
Well, I really hate to go into that because that takes me into part 3. But I'll just, I don't want to wait to spoil that. All right. I think there are 3 great, truly great epic poems that give you the essence of 3 consecutive civilizations and that come under 3 of my categories. But, I prove that in the book by discussing literature, education, et cetera, for each of these civilizations with a variety of examples. But if I just strip it down to epic poems, I classify Greece as I, the whole civilization, and there the voice is Homer. I classify Rome as M1, and there the voice is Virgil. And I classify the height of the medieval period as M2, and there the voice is Dante. Now you can't possibly say, that some of this garbage ordered by Stalin is sacrilegious even to mention. But nevertheless, if you go over the Divine Comedy the way I have done from the point of view of mode of integration, it is the same as socialist realism. In terms of characterization, it doesn't have a Prince, of course, because it takes place in heaven. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Hey, you want one other example of a very, very different kind of thing from the M2 era, from the Christian era. There's a wonderful play called Everyman. Everyman. A terrible play, but wonderful from the point of view of M2. Yes.
Thanks for your lecture. My question is about the idea that romantic art presents life as it might be and ought to be. Is that formula restricted to romantic art? And I wonder that because if we allow the artist latitude in his conception of what might be and ought to be, couldn't we say, for instance, that a naturalist presents life as it might be and ought to be according to...
But he denies that he's doing that. He does everything he can to refrain from value judgments. And if you said to him, you're not presenting it as it is, you're presenting it as it ought to be, he would consider that a mortal criticism. So on what grounds would you say that's what he's doing? He doesn't offer a positive. He doesn't say, this is the hero that we should be like. The most he will say is, sometimes he'll offer nice characters, but defend them on, this is the way things are. Don't accuse me of making up fantasies. He regards the projection of a better world as a fantasy. That's his theory.
Couldn't he say something like, if you have passionate values as is depicted in romantic art, it will just lead to frustration and despair because he has a malevolent universe premise. So therefore, we should just be like a Babbitt and have tepid values, not pursue anything too strongly, and that's really what we ought to do to live the best possible life.
Well, I don't know, maybe you're trying to say this. The naturalist approach implies a certain type of philosophy. If you're trying to say that, that's true. But it does not imply an idealistic type of philosophy a moral idealism where your goal is to improve the world. Unless you're talking about social naturalists. Now, social naturalists say, in a somewhat similar way to the socialist realists, that man is helpless because of society, and we should free him from society. But they say that all they're doing in their novels is presenting the evil. They're not making speeches on what we should do about it, which is implicit. But nevertheless, that's what they say. Let me try somebody over here. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by the idea, I think presented in the last lecture, the idea of the cultural product plus also its defense.
Yeah.
Very interested in how that plays out in the concretes of history. Specifically, I'm wondering how often is it that the creator of the product is also its defender versus those being different people?
Well, I would tend to think it depends on what field it is. For instance, if you're talking about physics, or even if you're talking about politics, the people who create the different systems go to great, and even about education. But now that's a good way, Jason, for me to get to the part that I left out. It is much less often in the case of art. In the case of art, the defenders are much more often the admirers, the literary critics, etc., than the artists themselves, at least of a new school. And I want to say that one of the reasons is that it is not true of artists what is true of all the other fields, namely that the person embodying a certain approach to integration knows it consciously and defends it. And let me see if I can tell you briefly why. The difference between an artist and other cultural creators is that the artist relies primarily on emotion. And Ayn Rand called that the sense of life. Now, this emotion would be of no use in the other fields. It wouldn't guide you as to how to study electricity and physics, for instance, or how to devise a curriculum in mathematics in education, or how to formulate a healthcare policy in politics. In all those realms, you have to go by purely thought and observation. But as Ayn Rand showed, that kind of emotion is indispensable, specifically to art, in creating it and responding to it. So an artist can, as against all the others, be ignorant of the mode of integration, even though his work consistently embodies it. That identifying your sense of life and integrating it with your explicit adult philosophy is a rare achievement. So an artist may never do it. He can be consistent in his mode of integration while repeatedly contradicting his animating philosophy in his public statements and even in the themes in his work, such as Dostoevsky. Now, when the two elements do clash, however, what counts aesthetically is the sense of life, because that's what shapes the universe of the novel or the play, and that is what primarily influences the reader. If he gets one kind of world that he's living in, and then some paragraphs at the end saying it means the exact opposite, the rest doesn't have, it is just forgotten. So in this one field, I would say that it's the merely implicit, not the articulate and explicit, which carries the cultural impact. The problem is, though, that the merely implicit has a fatal weakness, that it can't survive for long against the attacks of hostile critics who have explicit language to express themselves with. By definition, the non-explicit has no answers to explicit attacks. So any school that's at all controversial will begin to be undercut to start to accommodate its critics, to start to trim its sails, and ultimately to lose its identity. But I wanted to put that in because I made a big point of saying in an earlier lecture, that this was much more conscious and explicit. And for this reason, it's not in our... Yes, sir.
In your earlier lectures on the dim hypothesis, you presented the various schools inside of a field in a particular order based on mode of integration. You generally did I, and then D1, D2, M1, M2. And I notice now you've switched to a chronological presentation. I was wondering if you could comment on why.
Oh, thank you. Yes, because I think in retrospect that order in the lectures of always starting with I and then going to the D, I think, and then the M's, is a totally rationalistic mode of presentation. Because it's as though I've decided a priori that there's only 5. And now I'm going to start with a good one and pick this one and this one and this one. And the question is, how do you know there's only 5? You're picking at random without, who knows? Now, if you're going to do it, in a non-rationalistic way, then you have to say, if you want to know what movements there are, in some, regular way that would catch what they all are, that's how you have to present it. And the obvious one is chronological, because then you cover the centuries as you go. What is the dominant trend, as opposed to picking and choosing? Now I got to find a D1. Well, let me use this one and that one. So it was definitely a rationalist element in the form of presentation. I was so happy when I thought in writing it in the book, oh, thank goodness I got rid of that. And now I can go only by facts rather than deduction from my theory. Over there, yes.
Could you give some concrete examples of what you call non-objective symbolism in modernist literature?
Oh. Non-objective symbolism.
It's in...
Well, I think if you take painting as an example, Jackson Pollock with his smears, all those with, Marianne Suri's once said there's 2 kinds of modern art. There is the neat and the messy. Each of them has swirls, triangles. I've seen even a totally blank one that I was told this represents Heidegger's nothing. Now, I would call that a non-objective symbol. Now, there's all kinds of linguistic allusions in novels that no one would know. I can't think of one offhand, but because I stopped reading these things as soon as I spot any one of them. But, there'll be a term that refers to some earlier person's novel who was himself projecting a modern version of some ancient mythological character, and then suddenly you'll get the end result in the fact that this character wore yellow, but only on Tuesdays. And it makes no sense at all, but then you read all the notes. He wore yellow because the grandmother in the previous generation novel had jaundice, and she did that because she studied Homer too much, and etc. And you're supposed to tell that from they're absolutely crammed full of that, and they say that themselves. Okay, yes.
Ayn Rand described Alex Haley's Roots for its ability to create a mythology for African Americans. I'd like to know if you see that sometimes mythology or even fantasy can be a good form of Romanticism. Tolkien once said that he was creating a mythology for England.
Oh, of course. Why wouldn't fantasy be fantasy would be no good for naturalism, but why wouldn't it be good for Romanticism? I read fantasy all the time. That's the only way you can get out of this world. I mean, science fiction is a form of fantasy. I think there's many terrific books. I can't understand why you would think that, because there's nothing in the definition of Romanticism that would say you have to describe or stay in this world even. Oh, you mean what might be and ought to be? The might be? Is that what you're thinking?
Well, yes.
Well, the idea is fantasy has a meaning. And as long as there's a meaning in some way referring back to this world, it doesn't have to be actual characters that are here on this world. I mean, I've read fascinating stories that take place on another planet with, conflict and admirable characters and logical sequence, etc. And it doesn't bother me that it takes place on another planet because it's obvious, what it would mean. And it's even interesting, that they're not just people over again. So, absolutely. Now, if it's a fantasy that is just cut off from this world altogether, you don't have any idea, well, what its meaning be, or what are the attributes of the characters, what are they really doing, or why are they doing it? There's a great deal of science fiction, for example, which you open, and the first line will be something like, Pharaoh the Ninth aimed his blaster, I just close that right away. The kind of fantasy I like has a lot of worldly, elements. It's a world you can recognize. And then there's a couple of things that, you take off, and the person is then logical in regard to it. But certainly there's nothing Romanticism that
Thank you.
would detract from fantasy. Rod Serling was one of the greatest TV writers there is. And the whole thing was fantasy, but some of his are immortal. One of his was the, I shouldn't have said that because you asked me what it is, but it was the absolute, in my opinion, greatest work of literature ever to appear on television in the whole history of television. And the Twilight Zone, it was a complete fantasy. It did not take place on Earth at all. And I know Amy and a number of other people show it to their class because it makes an incredibly difficult philosophic point in another dimension. So I'll just tell you the name. What is the name of it? A Nice Place to Visit. If you can get that, like a TV or some rental of Twilight Zone, if you don't like that, I will be amazed. Yes.
I thought it was interesting that the naturalist movement developed and flourished pretty much at the exact time that the United States economically was reaching its absolute pinnacle. And I was wondering if the naturalist movement somehow foretold the decline in economic rights, or if they're just unrelated.
Oh no, I think it's expression of the same cultural development. But I think, and you can make a case that after the Civil War, even though the American industrialization, went up, our productiveness went up, our status in the world went up, the role of government started really to become more significant. The groundwork was laid, not in the way that you see in the 20th century, not even in the way you see in 1890, but it wasn't as though we had followed the Constitution up to 1890 and then Sherman sprang, so there was a development. I think the U.S. the disintegration was slower in the respect you mean because it was so explicit at the beginning what it should be. It was harder to drop it. On the other hand, the Romanticists were so non-explicit that it was much easier to override them. But the same overall trend finally, broke down the American system and broke down art. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
I think the Founding Fathers made it hard, whereas the Romanticists made it pretty easy to be overthrown, even though both finally were. Now, are we... Okay, I'm ready. I mean, unless you want to go on.
We'll do one last.
Okay. I'm just trying to prove to you I can get out of here before 12.
Thank you.
All right. Dr. Peikoff, I have a question about classifying a particular work of literature. Now, I understand you can't classify just every work of literature as one of the five. So is it true that only those, novels or stories can be classified as one of the 5 that are considered to be serious works in a given culture. So that, for instance, children's stories would not be any of those.
I've never made any study of children's stories to see whether they have a structure. The ones that I used for my daughter, there was nothing that you could call characterization. There was very little that you could call events, unless you take the Grimm brothers stories, and that was really, malevolent. All the children's stories I know are very. Grimm brothers are correctly named. They're very, very malevolent. They fall downhill, and the mice go blind, and
Right.
cradle falls, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't know enough about them to know whether they're developed enough as a form to distinguish such things as character and story and theme, et cetera. I've never seen anything like that.
Okay.
But let me just say that undoubtedly you could come up with hundreds of novels and plays that are nothing in my system, either because they're eclectic or mixed. But I think for that reason, they don't have that kind of influence. They just pick and choose, or they're nothing, not because they're mixed or eclectic, but because they literally are nothing. There's no philosophy and no mode of integration and no nothing. Like if you take a typical Broadway musical, they don't say, well, now how should we relate this world to the next, or abstractions or concretes or events or characterizations. They'll say, let's put a big number here because it's getting very slow, And if we can get her to sing here, that'll be great publicity. Now that, you can't then say, well, their mode of integration is how to put it together so as to make a box office. That's it. But that's not one of mine. Okay, thank you.